All right, continuing again. Hopefully this is getting really repetitive, which is not a bad thing because sometimes it takes a while before it kicks in. So we are talking about cardiorespiratory endurance training. Cardiorespiratory endurance capacity is measured by VO2max. Okay? So if you do appropriate cardiorespiratory endurance training, your VO2max will increase, and it does. According to Fick, VO2 max is affected by both cardiac output max and AVO2 difference max. So if VO2 max is increasing with training, it's through either cardiac output or AVO2 difference. Okay? We've already talked about this half. Okay? So now we're going to talk about this half. Okay? So in addition to increases in cardiac output max that occur with training, we also get increases in AVO2 difference max with training that help raise VO2 max. And AVO2 difference increases because oxygen is delivered at a greater rate and it's taken up at a greater rate. Okay? So in order to take up and use more oxygen, you need to deliver more and you need to take more up. Okay? On this recording, we're going to focus on delivery rate, okay, and the factors that affect delivery rate, or I should say maximal delivery rate after training. So why are we able to achieve a greater delivery rate after training? So if you remember from Chapter 7, we talked about oxygen delivery rate, and we said oxygen delivery rate was determined by two factors. One is the oxygen concentration of arterial blood, and the other one was blood flow rate. Okay. And we said that the oxygen carrying capacity of blood, or the oxygen concentration of blood, is determined by hemoglobin concentration and oxygen concentration. Okay? And the rate of blood flow to the muscle is determined by cardiac output and the distribution of cardiac output to the muscle. Okay? So these should be familiar. Now with training, we do see a greater delivery rate. We generally don't see an increase in the oxygen carrying capacity. Remember that oxygen saturation is already optimal, even before training. It cannot be improved. Hemoglobin, so I said on an earlier slide that an earlier recording, that with training we do see increases in blood volume, and that blood volume increases because of both increases in red blood cell and plasma volume. But that not everybody agrees that we get increases in red blood cell volume, which means that not everybody agrees that we get increases in hemoglobin. So for the purpose of this concept map, we are going to discount the fact that there could be increases in hemoglobin, because if there are, they're relatively small, not a significant contributor to the increase in delivery rate with training. So basically what we're saying is that delivery rate increases with training, not because we're carrying more oxygen, because that's already optimal before we even train. So if oxygen delivery rate is increasing with training and the oxygen carrying capacity is not, it must be because the blood flow rate is increased after training. Okay, so what determines how much blood flows to the muscle? Two things. First of all is the amount of blood flowing out of the heart. And the second thing is the distribution of that cardiac output going to the muscle. So you should remember this slide from Chapter 6. Okay, and we said that at rest you have cardiac output of about 5, and 15 to 20% of your cardiac output is distributed to the muscle, resulting in a muscle blood flow of about 0.75 liters per minute. During exercise, we see an increase in cardiac output and an increase in the percent distribution of that cardiac output to the muscle, resulting in a significant increase in the amount of blood flow to the muscle during heavy exercise. Okay. To take that one step further, with training, we see further increases in cardiac output, further increases in the percentage of that cardiac output distributed to the muscle, and therefore more muscle blood flow during exercise. Okay? So increased cardiac output, an increased percentage of the cardiac output going to the muscle, and therefore more total blood flow going to the muscle, contributing to a greater blood flow rate, and therefore a greater VO2 difference. Greater blood flow rate, greater VO2 difference, okay? Greater VO2 max. And that's what we're going to focus on here. Okay? So the increases in oxygen delivery rate are not due to carrying capacity. They're due to how much of that blood flow is distributed to the muscle, which has to do with cardiac output and distribution of blood to the muscle. So we've already talked about why cardiac output goes up with training, okay? Because increased stroke volume max goes up with training, and therefore cardiac output goes up with training. So that we've already talked about. But now you can see how the increase in stroke volume not only contributes to an increase in cardiac output and VO2 max, but this increase in stroke volume increases cardiac output, which helps contribute to the delivery rate. Okay, so increases in cardiac output contribute to VO2 max directly and indirectly through a VO2 difference. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this. What happens with training such that we distribute more of your cardiac output to the muscle? Okay, and that goes back to vasodilation, vasoconstriction, because remember that arterioles determine where blood flow goes. Okay, if we constrict an arteriole, you decrease flow to that area. If we dilate an arteriole, we increase flow to that area. Okay? And so what happens during exercise is we have a certain amount of blood flow, that's cardiac output, and it would be beneficial to deliver more of that cardiac output to the muscle. And because you have a fixed amount of blood, if you want to send more blood to the muscle, we have to send less blood everywhere else. Okay? So what we see during training is a greater SNS drive, and that SNS drive goes to the arterioles. And the arterioles cause constriction to all of the arterioles, okay, but let's just talk right now about the inactive tissues. Okay? So if we get less blood flow to the inactive tissues, that allows more blood available to be distributed to the muscle tissue. Okay? But why is the muscle tissue dilating? Okay? So remember that all of the arterioles receive SNS. They all respond through vasoconstriction, but active muscles have the ability to override the SNS, override the vasoconstriction, autoregulate, cause their own vasodilation, and we see that this autoregulation is increased with training. Okay? So together, this greater SNS is going to cause less flow to inactive. This greater autoregulation is going to cause more flow to the muscle. Okay? And less flow to the inactive is because of a decrease in radius. More flow to the muscle is because of an increase in radius. Okay? And the overall effect is that greater percentages of the cardiac output are distributed to the active muscle. Okay, so let's draw this out. So remember, we're at the bottom. We're trying to increase VO2max. We're working on this side. Okay, and remember, AVO2 difference is affected by oxygen delivery rate and oxygen uptake rate. Right now we're talking about oxygen delivery rate. Okay, and we'll talk about uptake rate later. So coming off the top of your map, what you're going to have is an increase in autoregulation by the active tissues. Okay. And that means more vasodilation by the active tissues, which means greater radius in the active tissues. Simultaneously, we're going to see greater SNS output to all tissues, but on our map we're only going to map out the things that contribute to a greater VO2 max. All right? So greater SNS output results in greater vasoconstriction to inactive, okay, which means lower radius in the arterioles going to the inactive. And together, these two things result in a greater percentage of cardiac output being distributed to the muscle. Okay? And if a greater percentage of the cardiac output is being distributed to the muscle, we're going to have a greater muscle blood flow rate, okay, which is going to result in more oxygen delivery rate. Okay, and remember, this cardiac output also comes in here. Okay, so the reason why the muscle is receiving more blood flow is because there's more blood to distribute, and a greater percentage of it is being distributed to the muscle. Okay, so an increase in muscle blood flow rate means, and what carries, what's in that blood? Oxygen, which means a greater oxygen delivery rate, greater AVO2 difference at max, greater VO2 max at max. Okay. So two more coming off of the top, coming in to our VO2 max through AVO2 difference, coming into AVO2 difference through oxygen delivery rate. Okay, and in order to deliver more oxygen, we have to deliver more blood, and we do that because a greater percentage of the blood is distributed to the muscle, and there's a greater amount of blood to distribute. Okay. So that's one portion of this. Now there's another effect, another side effect that comes off this, these effectors. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about this increase in radius. Okay. Because what we see is that overall in this body, overall in the body, the increase in radius is greater than the decrease in radius. So what we see in the body is an overall increase in radius. And when you hear increase in radius, you should be thinking about peripheral resistance. Okay, so we get an overall increase in radius in the body. This is going to decrease peripheral resistance because this is R. This is length times viscosity over R. Okay, so if R goes up, PR goes down. Okay, and we've already talked about this. Peripheral resistance also contributes to an increase in VO2max. Okay, let's see how much I can fit on here. And these are all max values. Okay. So do you remember how peripheral resistance leads to an increase in cardiac output? We know it has to do with an increase in stroke volume. Okay. So is it preload, afterload, or contractility? Okay. So if you go back on one of the previous recordings, I made the connection between a reduction in peripheral resistance and an increase in stroke volume, because remember that we already talked about viscosity, and we get a decrease in viscosity with training due to an increase in plasma. So we got two different things working towards a lower peripheral resistance with training. So remember that a lower peripheral resistance means less afterload, less aortic pressure, and that's P2 during when blood's moving out of the left ventricle. P2 essentially is afterload aortic pressure. So with the lower peripheral resistance, we get lower afterload, lower aortic pressure, which is P2, which means that the pressure gradient, P1 minus P2, which is the gradient between the left ventricle and the aorta, is bigger, and therefore more blood needs to come out before equilibrium is achieved, and therefore more blood comes out. Okay. So coming off of this increase in radius, it's going to contribute to a greater distribution of blood flow to muscle, but it's also going to contribute to a greater stroke volume through peripheral resistance.